All right, welcome back to the JavaScript training. Um, this section will be going over xComponent, which is PayPal's cross-domain component library. This will be another three-part training section. The first being the lecture, then we're going to do an exercise and a troubleshooting session as well. So first off, xComponent, just a quick overview. So xComponent is a PayPal library that makes it easy to create components that can communicate across multiple domains. So xComponent can be rendered in an iframe, a lightbox, or a pop-up. This means that they are sandbox and do not negatively affect the parent site. xComponents are compatible with many JavaScript frameworks, including Angular and React. There's even documentation built for Angular and React on how to create components specifically for those frameworks. And so how do you think xComponent library communicates across domains? Well, it communicates using the same post-robot library that we went through in the previous section. And xComponent is open sourced on GitHub, where you can find all the documentation. It is a rather new library, so the documentation is a little scarce, but we are going to go through it real quick. All right, so xComponent, they label it as a cross-domain component toolkit, where we can render iframe or pop-up on a different domain. Sounds a lot like checkout.js. So you'll see in the actual example that the main portion of the xComponent is what I like to call the definition file, which is the xComponent.create. So this is where you kind of define your xComponent, and you give it some setup information, and then the props object is the most important part of the xComponent. It is actually defines the properties that are messaged in between the domains. So you'll see here we're just creating a simple xComponent, and we are giving it pre-filled email and on login, which is a function. And then we can set required or not. So this file typically should be in its own, or this xComponent.create should probably be in its own file, because it is required on both the parent page and the child, which is in the iframe in the example that we've been doing. So then, as our company who is actually building the login functionality, there's a object on the global window called xchild, where we can get the props that were passed. You can also use window.xprops, and that's what we'll actually be using for our exercises. But you'll see this is why we split it out into its own file, because we are including the login component definition file. And then you can see we're just calling window.xchild.props. .prefilled email, we're just seeing if it is not undefined, and if it's not, we are setting that pre-filled email to the input like we've been doing in our other exercises. But it makes this super easy. We don't even have to do postrobot.on or postrobot.send. All that communication is actually automatically happening in the background. For our actual exercise, we're going to be using window.xprops and not xchild, which is kind of just an alias, but it's the new way that this library is heading. So, and then for as far as the on login portion of the properties, remember this is in the child, the iframe, we call window.xchild.props.onLogin, and since onLogin is a function, we execute it and we send it email. So that is actually messaged back to the parent page. So then as the component user, which would be kind of like our merchant in our examples, you can see once again that they are putting in the component definition file. That's why we want to separate it out, because it is required on both parent and child. And then you can see they're just doing my component.render, which renders an iframe, and saying pre-filled email is foo@bar.com, and then on login is this function, and put it inside of an ID called container, which is defined here. So probably the most important part to note about this is that these, when you pass to render, what you can pass to render is what is defined in the definition file under the props. So everything that I can pass into render will be defined in the component definition file under the props array. All right. So xComponent structure, so how are these components structured? We kind of went over it in the documentation there. We're going to go over it one more time real quickly. So the main concept of the xComponent is the definition file. The component definition should be separated into its own file because you are required to include it on both the parent and the child windows. So by looking at the xComponent definition file, you can see all the ways you can interact with the component by looking at that props object. So in this example, we have a pre-filled email that is a string and an onLogin that is a function, just like the documentation. So then the parent page loads the definition file first and calls render, which then creates an iframe tag and puts it into the DOM. The iframe page that we're loading needs to have the script include for the definition file as well, because it's going to load the definition first. And then when rendered, it's going to use post-robot to send an init message back to the parent. So then the post-robot on, so the parent receives the message and actually then message the xComponent.props to the child. The child stores the response on window.xprops, or in the documentation it was window.xchild.props, but we'll use window.xprops. And now the child can use the props just like they did in the documentation. So we say window.xprops.prefilled email would contain the actual email that was passed across, and the login would be the function that we could execute that was passed across. All right, so finally here's a diagram going over a pretty basic xComponent flow. So you have your parent and your child. The parent's going to load the definition file. It's going to call xComponent.render, which actually creates the iframe and makes the child exist. The child's then going to load the definition file, and it's going to do a post-robot.send init, which then, and on the parent, you'll see that when we called render, it also does a post-robot on init, so it's listening for the init message from the child. So the child message is going to send the init, and then the parent actually responds with its properties. So the xComponent.props goes over to the child, and now window.xprops is set, and the child can actually use these props that were sent over from the parent. So that's it for the lecture on xComponent. It is a pretty short lecture, but the real work is done in the exercises and the troubleshooting portions.